She came to him with the two smallest shoes she'd ever held in her life, and a photograph that proved something miraculous was growing inside her. She came ready to tell the most dangerous man in America that he was going to be a father. Instead, she watched him press his mouth against another woman's hair, and heard him laugh about the wife waiting at home. Vivian Hale walked into that building carrying everything. She walked out carrying nothing but a decision so final it would shatter both their worlds. Some truths don't break you slowly, they break you all at once. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Part 1. The shoes she never gave him. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and Vivian stepped out into a silence so complete she could hear the air recycling through the vents above her head. She hadn't called ahead. That was intentional. In 2 years of marriage to Damian Moretti, she had learned that the element of surprise was the only honest currency left between them, and even that was running low. He kept this penthouse office separate from the Moretti Group's main tower downtown, a private floor above a building that didn't carry his name on any lease, accessible only through a service elevator she'd memorized the code for 18 months ago when she'd had a reason to think she might need it someday. She'd never used it until now. The hallway was all dark marble and recessed lighting, the kind of space that communicated power without having to say a word about it. Vivian's heels made almost no sound on the stone. She was wearing the gray dress he'd bought her in Milan, the one he'd said made her look like she belonged somewhere expensive. She'd put it on this morning deliberately, the same way she'd wrapped the small white box with the ribbon, the same way she'd folded the ultrasound photo into the envelope and written his name on the front in her own handwriting. Damian. Just that. No last name. Like he was still the man she'd believed he was becoming. She was 8 weeks along. The nausea had been brutal the past 3 mornings, bad enough that she'd had to pull over on the interstate twice last week, and still she'd driven 2 hours to get here instead of calling, because some things needed to be said in person. Some things needed a witness. She needed to see his face when she told him. She needed that one real moment, one moment where all the careful distance between them collapsed, and he looked at her like she was something more than decorative. The box in her hands was light, just the shoes inside, pale yellow cotton, soft enough that she'd held them in her palm for 10 minutes in the store before the saleswoman had quietly brought tissues. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried in public. She'd cried anyway. She turned the last corner in the hallway and stopped. The door to his private office was open. Not all the way, maybe 6 inches, enough that the light from inside cut a narrow strip across the marble floor. Enough that she could hear voices. She recognized his first. Low, unhurried, with that particular quality of control he deployed in every room he entered. The voice of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to raise it. She didn't recognize the second voice immediately. Female. Soft. Close. Vivian moved without thinking, pressing herself against the wall to the right of the door, the box held against her chest. The strip of light fell across the floor 3 feet in front of her, and she stood just outside it, breathing carefully through her nose the way she did when the nausea threatened to overtake her at inconvenient moments. She heard him say something she couldn't catch, a murmur, low and almost casual, and then she heard the woman laugh. It was a private laugh, the kind that lives between 2 people who have stopped being careful around each other. Vivian leaned her head slightly toward the gap. She saw them through the sliver of open door. Damian had his back to the entrance. He was still in his shirt, collar open, jacket discarded somewhere behind him. His hand was at the back of the woman's head. His personal assistant, she registered slowly. Elena Vasquez, the one with the efficient emails and the pressed blazers and the way of summarizing meetings with a thoroughness that had always made Vivian vaguely uncomfortable without giving her any concrete reason to say so. Elena had her face turned into his neck. His thumb was moving against her hair. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. It was worse than that. It was comfortable. It was 2 people standing in a room together as if they'd stood that way 100 times before and would stand that way 100 times after, without drama, without apology, without any awareness whatsoever that a woman in a gray Milan dress was standing in the hallway holding a box of baby shoes and trying to remember how to breathe. Vivian did not move. She should have walked away immediately. She understood this later, understood it clearly, with the kind of cold, analytical hindsight that kicks in once your body has already made its decisions and your mind is just along for the ride. But she didn't walk away. She stood there for 4 more seconds that felt like something measured in geological time, and in those 4 seconds, she heard him speak again. "She's not going to be a problem." His voice was almost amused. "Vivian's a perfect Mafia wife. She stays in the lane, she doesn't ask questions, she shows up when she's supposed to show up. It's practically a gift." Elena said something quiet that Vivian couldn't hear. "No," Damien said. "She's useful. That's different from mattering." Vivian took 1 step back, then another. Her heels found the marble in absolute silence, 1 foot behind the other, the box still against her chest, and she turned, slowly, deliberately, with the precise controlled movement of a woman who has just understood something and refuses to let her body betray the scale of it. And she walked back down the hall. She did not run. She pressed the button for the service elevator and she stood in front of the doors and she watched her own reflection in the brushed metal, a woman in a gray dress holding a white box with a yellow ribbon. And she did not cry. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator for 11 floors with the box in her hands and the ultrasound photo in the envelope in her purse and the knowledge growing inside her, already 8 weeks old and entirely unaware that the world above it had just reorganized itself around a single overheard sentence. She's useful. That's different from mattering. By the time she reached the lobby, she had made the decision. It had not always been this way, and that was the part that made it nearly unbearable. She had met Damien Moretti at a legal conference in Boston, of all places. She'd been 3 years into a career in financial compliance, and he'd been, whatever he was, dressed like a senator's son, standing at the edge of a reception she'd attended only because a senior partner had strongly suggested she make an appearance. He'd asked her what she was drinking. She'd told him it was sparkling water because she was working. He'd said, "I respect that." And she'd thought he was being sarcastic until she looked at his face and realized he wasn't. That was the thing about Damien that had caught her entirely off guard. He listened, or he had the extraordinary ability to make you feel like he did, which she now understood was not the same thing, but at 29, sitting across from a man who seemed genuinely interested in the technical architecture of anti-money laundering compliance frameworks, the distinction had not been immediately obvious. They had dated for 8 months before she found out who he actually was. The Moretti name had been a distant abstraction to her. She'd heard it in contexts she hadn't paid close attention to, organized crime coverage. She skimmed past in the news because it wasn't her world, wasn't her concern. When she figured it out, when she sat across from a colleague over lunch and heard the name Moretti in a sentence that included the words federal investigation and 3 sitting judges, she'd gone home that evening and put the pieces together with the same systematic rigor she applied to audit trails at work, and by midnight she'd had a profile that would have made an FBI analyst uncomfortable. She'd confronted him that same night. He hadn't denied any of it. What he'd said was, "I never lied to you about who I am. I didn't volunteer it because it's not a conversation I lead with. But you've known me 8 months. Did anything I showed you feel false?" And the infuriating answer was no. Nothing had felt false. That was exactly the problem. She'd left, spent 3 weeks refusing his calls, moving through her days with the grim productivity of someone trying to outrun something they know is already inside them. Then he'd shown up at her office, just walked past the front desk with the calm certainty of a man who understood that most security existed only for people who acted like they needed permission. And he'd stood in the doorway of her office and said, "I'm not asking you to approve of what I do. I'm asking if you think what's between us is worth more than what you're scared of." She'd said yes. She still didn't entirely forgive herself for that. The wedding had been small by his world standards. 60 people in a venue that cost more per hour than most people's annual salaries. No spectacle, no Godfather theater. Damien had worn a dark suit. She'd worn an ivory dress with no train because she hated fuss. His sister Sophia had cried. His mother had not, but had taken Vivian's hands in both of hers after the ceremony and said in Italian-accented English so precise it felt like a formal legal document, "You are the best thing that has happened to this family in 20 years. Don't let him convince you otherwise." Vivian had laughed. She'd thought it was affection. She understood now it had been a warning. She drove north for 40 minutes without any particular destination, just putting distance between herself and the building. The box sat on the passenger seat. She'd stopped opening it about an hour after she bought it. Had made herself stop touching the shoes because the softness of them was doing something to her chest that she couldn't afford in operational terms. She pulled off at a rest stop, killed the engine, and sat in the parking lot with the windows down while the afternoon light flattened across the asphalt. She was a financial compliance specialist who had spent the last 2 years inside the peripheral structure of an organized crime empire. She had not participated, Damien had been clear about that, had actually, to his credit, maintained a cleaner separation between their domestic life and his professional one than she'd expected, and she had kept her own work, her own accounts, her own firm footing in the legal world. But proximity was its own form of education. She'd learned things. Not because he'd told her, but because she had eyes, and she was very good at reading what she saw. She knew how money moved through the Moretti structure. She'd mapped it in her head the way she mapped anything, compulsively, systematically, because pattern recognition was the thing her brain did when it was stressed, and also when it was bored, and she'd been both inside this marriage. She knew which accounts were insulated and which were exposed. She knew the legal architecture of the property settlements because she'd read every contract she'd ever been asked to sign with the attention of someone who understood that every document is also an exit map if you know how to read it. She'd known, on some level, for at least 6 months, that she might need to read hers. She sat in the rest stop parking lot until a truck pulled in 3 spaces down and a family got out. 2 kids, a father carrying a diaper bag, a mother who looked tired in the specific way that meant something permanent and ordinary and true. And Vivian watched them walk toward the facility and felt something in her chest crack open so quietly that she almost missed it. She started the car. She drove another 20 minutes before she pulled off again, this time at a public library on the outskirts of a town she'd never been to. And she sat in the parking lot and opened her phone and started making calls. The first was to her attorney, her own, the one Damien didn't know about, retained 6 months ago out of an office in Providence, paid from the discretionary fund she'd built slowly and legally and without fanfare from her own professional income. She got voicemail. She left a message that was brief and precise and contained the phrase file immediately without any preamble. The second call was to her bank, not the joint account, her private one. The third was to a number she'd memorized but never dialed, a woman she'd met once at a compliance conference who specialized in identity restructuring for domestic crisis clients and who had handed her a card 2 years ago with a look that said, "In case you ever need this," without making it anything more than that. Vivian needed it now. She pressed call. "I remember you," the woman said when she picked up. Her name was Rosalind Marsh, and she had the voice of someone who'd had this conversation before and understood how much it cost the person on the other end. "I need to start over," Vivian said. "Completely. I have about a 6-hour window before anyone figures out I was supposed to be somewhere today. Where are you now?" "A library parking lot in—" She looked around. "Dunfield, Connecticut." "Okay," Rosalind said. "Don't go home tonight." "I wasn't planning to." "Do you have access to liquid funds that can't be traced back?" "Yes." A pause. "You've been planning this." "Not this specifically," Vivian said, "but something like this." "Yes." Another pause, this one different. The particular silence of a professional recalibrating the scope of what she's dealing with. "How much time do you think you realistically have before the situation escalates?" Vivian looked at the white box on the passenger seat. The yellow ribbon had come slightly undone on one side. "Not much," she said. "His people are very good at finding things." "Then we need to move tonight. Can you get to Hartford by 7? "Yes. I'll be there. Bring everything you need to never go back." Rosalind's voice didn't soften or harden. It just stayed level, practical. The voice of a woman who understood that sentiment was a luxury that came later, after the work was done. "And Vivian, whatever happened today, you made the right call." Vivian didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to have an opinion about right calls yet. She was still in the part where you just move. She put the car in reverse. What she didn't know What she couldn't have known, sitting in that library parking lot with the yellow ribboned box and a new name already forming somewhere in her future, was that the 42nd floor had a security camera in the hallway outside Damien's private office. A narrow lens positioned above the elevator bank installed 18 months ago after a threat assessment that Victor Kane had insisted on and Damien had agreed to without particular interest. The camera had a motion sensor and a timestamp. It had recorded her arriving at 2:47 p.m. It had recorded her leaving at 2:51 p.m. 4 minutes. The entirety of her second anniversary visit. She'd walked in carrying something. The camera couldn't resolve what. And she'd walked out carrying it still. And between those 2 moments, the quality of the way she moved had changed in a way that a good analyst would notice immediately and a great one would lose sleep over. Victor Kane was a great one. He pulled the footage at 5:18 p.m. when a routine check flagged the motion event, and he watched it twice. And then he sat at his desk in the security office 3 floors below and thought about what it meant that Damien's wife had come and gone in 4 minutes without ever being announced. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He pulled the footage a third time and watched Vivian Hale walk toward that office door and then stop, her whole body registering something, and then turn and come back with a stillness so absolute it was almost violent. He thought about the last time he'd seen that kind of stillness in a person's body. It was never good. It meant something had been decided. Victor Kane had worked for Damien Moretti for 11 years. He knew the difference between a problem that was coming and a problem that had already arrived. He picked up the phone again. This time he dialed. "She was here," he said when Damien picked up. "Came up at 2:47, left 4 minutes later without making contact. Security footage shows she stopped outside your office door." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Pull everything," Damien said. His voice had changed. The ease had gone out of it, and something older and more precise had moved in. "Financial accounts, phone activity, anything she's touched in the last 6 months. I want it in an hour." "You think she ran?" "I think she's running," Damien said. "There's a difference." "What do you want me to do if we find her?" Another silence. Shorter this time. "Find her first," Damien said. "We'll figure out the rest." The line went dead. Victor Kane set his phone on the desk and looked at the frozen image on his screen. Vivian in the hallway, caught mid-turn, the white box in her arms and her face angled just enough away from the camera that he couldn't read her expression. He could read her posture. He'd been reading people for 30 years and he knew exactly what a woman looked like when she was carrying something she'd decided to carry alone. He pulled up the financial database and started typing. Victor Kane had a particular method for working through a crisis, developed over 30 years in a profession that rewarded patience and punished sentiment. He started at the edges and moved inward. He pulled the peripheral data first, the small transactions, the minor schedule deviations, the calls to numbers that weren't in the primary contact file, and he built a picture from the outside in, because in his experience, the center of a thing was always the last place to give itself up. What he found in Vivian Hale's financial history over the past 6 months stopped him cold. Not because it was criminal, because it was extraordinarily, methodically clean. She'd been siphoning nothing, not a dollar that wasn't legally hers. Every withdrawal from her private account, the one she'd opened under her maiden name, the one Damien had known about in the abstract and never examined because he'd trusted her without ever actually thinking about what that meant, corresponded to income she'd generated through her own consulting work, deposited in her own name, taxed correctly, spent on things that left no pattern he could interpret as preparation. Except it was preparation. Kane could see that now, looking at the aggregate. She hadn't been hiding money. She'd been accumulating standing, legal standing, financial independence, a clean professional record entirely separate from the Moretti name. She'd been building a floor under herself so carefully and over such a long period of time that there was nothing he could point to and call suspicious. It was the most disciplined exit strategy he'd ever encountered, and he'd spent a career watching people try to run from Damien Moretti. He sat back in his chair and pressed his fingers against his mouth and thought about what that meant about the woman he'd been underestimating for 2 years. He called Damien back at 6:40 p.m. "She didn't take anything she wasn't entitled to," he said. "Her legal filing hit the court system at 5:52 p.m. Divorce. Her attorney's out of Providence. She's been retained for 6 months." The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. Heavier. 6 months, Damien said. Yes. She's been planning this for 6 months. Longer, probably. The attorney retention is just the first thing I can date with certainty. Another silence. Kane waited because he'd learned that the most useful thing he could do in moments like this was give Damien the space to process without filling it with his own voice. Where is she? I don't have her yet. She's not at the house, not at the apartment she used when she worked in the city, not at any of the 3 hotels she's used before. Her phone went dark at 3:22 p.m. She either switched it off or destroyed it. I'm working on the car. Work faster. Damien. Kane paused. This was the part he didn't want to say, and was going to say anyway because that was the job. The footage from the hallway. She came up at 2:47 and left at 2:51. She stopped outside your office door. Damien said nothing. She heard something, Kane said. Whatever she heard, it's what made her go. The divorce filing was already prepared. She was ready to pull the trigger at any point. But something today accelerated it. The line was so quiet Kane could hear the ambient sound of wherever Damien was standing. A room with high ceilings, the faint movement of air. Pull the audio from the office, Damien said finally. His voice had lost all its inflection. It had become the voice he used when something had to be done, and emotion was a resource he was conserving for later. It's already flagged. Do you want me to? No, Damien said. I'll listen to it myself. He hung up. Kane set his phone down and looked at his screen and felt something he rarely allowed himself in this work, something adjacent to pity, though he would have rejected the word if anyone had offered it to him. He was 53 years old, and he had seen Damien Moretti dismantle organizations, negotiate with men who operated outside any law, and make decisions that would have broken most people in half without visible effect. He had never seen him make a mistake he couldn't correct. He thought, for the first time, that he might be watching the beginning of one. Damien listened to the audio from his office at 7:15 p.m., sitting alone at the desk where the recording had been made, with his jacket still on and a glass of water he hadn't touched on the surface in front of him. He listened to himself talking to Elena. He listened to the ease in his own voice, the comfort, the carelessness, the specific quality of a man who thought no one was listening. She's not going to be a problem. Vivian's a perfect Mafia wife. She stays in the lane. She doesn't ask questions. He pressed stop before it finished. He sat for a long time with his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He let himself actually feel the full weight of what he was looking at without immediately moving to manage it, without immediately calculating the operational response. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has just permanently altered the landscape of your life, and he let it be exactly as bad as it was. Then he stood up. He walked to the window. 42 floors of Manhattan below him, the lights organizing themselves into the familiar grid he'd looked at from this window for 11 years. And he stood there and thought about the last time he'd really looked at his wife, not observed her, not noted her presence at an event or registered that she was across the room. Looked at her. The way you look at someone when you understand they are a complete separate person with an interior life that has nothing to do with what they're useful for. He couldn't find it. He reached back through 2 years of marriage, and he couldn't locate a single moment where he'd looked at her with his full attention and thought, who are you right now? What are you carrying? What do you need? He'd looked at Elena that way, regularly, with ease. The realization didn't arrive with any particular drama. It arrived the way most devastating things do. Quietly, in a moment of stillness, while you're standing at a window 42 floors above the city that proved you were powerful, wondering why you feel like nothing. He picked up his phone and called Elena. She answered on the second ring, and before she could say anything, he said, "It's over. This is the last call about this." A pause. "Damien, I'm not negotiating it, and I'm not explaining it. It's done." He kept his voice flat. "I'll handle the professional transition through HR in the morning. You'll be compensated fairly and given an excellent reference. I'm sorry for how this went." He hung up. It didn't make him feel better. He hadn't expected it to. Doing the right thing after the damage is already done is not absolution. It's just arithmetic. He called Kane back. "I need her found," he said. "Not for the organization. This is personal. Use personal resources only. Don't route anything through the Moretti structure. Don't involve anyone who reports to the board. Just you and two people you trust completely. Kane was quiet for a moment. That's going to slow things down. I know. Can I ask why? Because whatever she's running from, I'm part of it, Damien said. And I'm not going to find her with the same apparatus that made her want to run. Another pause. Then Kane said, There's something else. The quality of his voice had shifted, a half step toward something Kane almost never deployed, which was caution. Not strategic caution, personal caution. The kind that preceded information that changed things. Say it, Damien said. Her medical records. I pulled them as part of the standard search. I know you said keep it clean, but I needed a full picture to establish her current status. A pause. She had an OB appointment 10 days ago. First one. Damien went very still. First OB appointment, he repeated. 8 weeks, Kane said. The intake file flags it as an initial prenatal visit. The word prenatal sat in the air of the empty office like something that had changed the atmospheric pressure of the room. Damien put one hand flat on the surface of the desk. The glass of water was still there, untouched, room temperature now. He stared at it. She came here today, he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. To tell me. Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. She came to tell me, Damien said again, and she stopped outside the door and she heard... He stopped. He picked up the glass of water and set it down somewhere else, not because he needed to move it, but because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't putting them through the window. Find her, Victor. Find her tonight. I'm working on it. Work harder. She became Claire Ashton in a back office in Hartford at 8:30 p.m., which was faster than she'd expected and slower than she'd hoped. Rosalind Marsh worked with the efficient lack of ceremony of a woman who understood that the people who came to her were already past the part where they needed comfort. They needed mechanics. New documentation, new paper trail, new geographic anchor. She'd arranged a Connecticut driver's license, a social security number with a clean history, and a debit card attached to an account seeded with funds routed through 3 intermediaries, all of it legal under a framework Vivian didn't ask her to explain because she didn't need to understand the architecture. She just needed to live inside it. You should know, Rosalind said, sliding a folder across the table, that your husband's people will find the car within 48 hours, regardless of how carefully you've placed it. It's on a camera system. I know. Vivian had left the car at a park and ride near the Hartford train station and taken a cab to the office. I'm not taking it. You have transportation? I'll buy something cash tomorrow. Used lot. Private seller. She'd researched this. She'd researched everything. I need a place for tonight. Rosalind gave her an address as a short-term rental held in the name of a shell entity that had no connection to either Vivian Hale or Claire Ashton, and a key. And she stood up and extended her hand with the directness of a person concluding a business transaction. One more thing, Rosalind said, and her eyes moved briefly, almost involuntarily, to the slight curve beneath Vivian's dress, barely visible at 8 weeks, but visible to a woman who knew what to look for. You'll need prenatal care under the new identity. I can give you a name in the network. Vivian took the key. Thank you. Are you going to be all right? It was the first personal question Rosalind had asked in 2 hours of highly efficient logistics. Vivian looked at her for a moment, at the directness of her, the no-nonsense architecture of a woman who had built her entire professional life around helping people survive the consequences of loving the wrong person, and she thought about what an honest answer to that question would look like. Eventually, she said. Not tonight. Rosalind nodded. That was apparently a good enough answer, because she didn't push. Vivian walked out into the Hartford night with a new name and an 8-week-old secret and the ghost of yellow ribbons still in her muscle memory, and she did not look back at the office, and she did not think about the 42nd floor, and she did not let herself think about the word eventually and how far away it felt from where she was standing. She thought about the coast instead. She'd always wanted to live somewhere she could hear water. The car surfaced on a transit authority camera at 9:17 a.m. the following morning, exactly where she'd left it, 41 hours earlier than Kane had predicted. He had good people. By noon, they had traced her movements to the Hartford cab company. By 2 p.m., they had the address of the short-term rental, which was empty by then. She'd been gone since 6 in the morning, which suggested she'd slept maybe 3 hours and then moved again before daylight. Kane spread a map across the conference table in his private office and looked at the directional pattern of her movements. South from the Moretti penthouse, northwest to Hartford, then, according to the cab company's second record, which his team had pulled from a different database, east. East meant coast. He called Damien, who hadn't slept. He could tell by the quality of silence on the line. Alert, wired, the particular tension of a man who has been awake in a dark room thinking for too many hours. She went east, Kane said. Coastal direction. I'm narrowing the radius now. How long? Days. Maybe less if she makes a mistake, but she hasn't made any so far. He hesitated. She's good at this, Damien. Better than she should be. I know. A pause. She's a compliance specialist. She's spent her career mapping financial systems for vulnerabilities. She's been doing the same thing to our structure for 2 years, and I didn't see it because I wasn't looking. Kane was quiet for a moment. Do you want to bring in more resources? No, keep it to what we have. Damien's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, an edge that wasn't anger but was adjacent to it. The sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation faster than was comfortable. She's not a target, Victor. She's my wife. She's carrying my child. The way we find her matters as much as finding her. Understood. And Victor, nobody else knows about the pregnancy. Nobody in the organization, nobody on the board. That information doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, Kane confirmed. He hung up and looked at the map again. The coastal strip of Connecticut blended into Rhode Island, into Massachusetts, a long, irregular edge of the country that was full of small towns where a woman with a new name and cash could disappear into the fabric of ordinary life without difficulty. He picked up a red marker and drew a rough arc from Hartford to the coast. Somewhere inside that arc, Vivian Hale was becoming someone else. He started making calls. She found the town by accident, which was the way she'd always found the things that mattered. Harwick, Rhode Island, had a population of just under 4,000 and a harbor that smelled like salt and diesel and something older underneath both of those things, a mineral coldness that came off the water when the wind changed and hit you in the chest in a way that felt, unexpectedly, like being told the truth. She'd been driving the used Civic she'd bought from a private seller in New London for 3 hours before she turned down a coastal road and saw the harbor. And she'd pulled over before she'd consciously decided to. And she'd sat with the window down and listened to the water for 10 minutes. And that had been that. She rented a furnished room above a hardware store from a landlord named George Peck, who didn't ask questions and didn't make eye contact in a way that communicated not hostility, but a fundamental philosophy about other people's business. She paid 3 months in advance, cash. He gave her a key and a list of which burners on the stove ran hot. She bought groceries. She made an appointment with a doctor in Providence under her new name, a 40-minute drive she made in the early morning when the roads were empty. She ate saltine crackers at 6 a.m. when the nausea was worst, and she sat at the small table by the window that looked out over the hardware store's parking lot and a strip of sky that turned extraordinary colors at sunrise. And she tried to build something like routine out of the rubble. She didn't think about Damien during the day. She'd made a decision about that, clear and practical. Daytime was for function, and grief was a nighttime thing. A dark hours thing. Something that happened after the crackers and before the color in the sky. During the day she was Claire Ashton, and Claire Ashton was fine. At night she was Vivian, and Vivian was not fine, and she sat with that too, the same way she'd sat with everything else. Without flinching, without apology, because the worst thing you could do with the truth was pretend it wasn't there. She thought about what he'd said. She's useful. That's different from mattering. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn something sharp over in your hands, carefully, checking every angle, trying to understand not just what it said, but why it had the particular weight it did. It wasn't that she'd been blind. It wasn't that she hadn't suspected. It was that she'd chosen, over and over again, to weigh what he did against what he said, and she'd told herself the scale balanced when it hadn't. She'd been doing compliance work on her own marriage and cooking the books. That was the part she was going to have to live with. At 11:30 on her fourth night in Harwick, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of ginger tea going cold beside her when her new phone, the prepaid, unregistered one she'd bought in Hartford, buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "We need to talk, not about what you think. R." She stared at it. R. She didn't know who R was. She didn't know anyone who would have this number, which meant either Rosalind Marsh was contacting her outside their agreed protocol, or someone else had found it, which was a different kind of problem entirely. She typed, "Who is this?" The reply came in under 30 seconds. Rafael Soto, Castellano family. "I know that name means something to you. I'm not reaching out as an enemy. I'm reaching out because I have information about your husband that you don't have yet, and it changes what you think you're running from." Vivian set the phone on the table. The Castellano family. She knew that name. Everyone in proximity to the Moretti organization knew that name. It was the one you didn't say at the wrong moment. The organization that had been in a cold territorial negotiation with the Morettis for 4 years. The one that Damien spoke about with the particular economical precision he reserved for things he took very seriously. She picked the phone back up. "How did you get this number? We've been watching your husband search for you. We have better visibility into his operation than he realizes. I'm not going to lie to you about that. What do you want? A conversation? In person. I can be in Harwick by tomorrow morning." Her blood went cold in a specific physical way, the kind that starts at the back of the neck and moves forward. He knew where she was, which meant the Castellano family knew where she was. And if the Castellano family knew where she was, then Damien's people were going to find her inside of days, not weeks, because information at that level didn't stay contained and didn't move in only one direction. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot and the strip of dark sky above the hardware store, and she pressed her palm flat against the glass and thought through the geometry of her situation with the same cold clarity she'd used in the Hartford parking lot. And what she arrived at was this. She had run from one threat and landed inside another, and the second one knew where she was sleeping. She typed, "If you know where I am, you know I'm not in a position to refuse." His reply was immediate. "That's not how I wanted this to go. But yes, you understand the situation correctly." She looked at her reflection in the dark window. A woman with her palm on cold glass, 8 weeks pregnant, 2 weeks into a new name, in a town she'd chosen because of how the water smelled. She thought about the yellow ribbon coming undone on the passenger seat. She thought about she's useful, that's different from mattering. She typed her final message of the night and set the phone face down on the table. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., the harbor. Outside, the water moved against the pilings with a sound like something being decided, and somewhere in the dark above the hardware store, the first faint color of another dawn was beginning to announce itself at the edge of the sky. And Vivian Hale, who was Claire Ashton now, who was alone now, who was building a future out of what she had left, stood at the window and understood that the world she'd run from had just found a way to follow her. The harbor at 8 in the morning smelled like brine and cold engine oil and the particular sharpness of a Rhode Island autumn that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be beautiful or brutal. Vivian arrived 12 minutes early, which was deliberate. She wanted to see him before he saw her, wanted to read the geography of how he moved through a space before she had to sit across from it. She stood near the far end of the dock with a coffee she wasn't drinking, watching the boats knock softly against their moorings, and she thought about exits. There was the dock itself, the parking lot behind her, a narrow alley between the harbor master's building and a bait shop that opened onto a side street. She'd walked all 3 routes the previous night at 2 a.m. when sleep had become obviously theoretical. She knew which one was fastest. Rafael Soto arrived at 7:58. She clocked him before he saw her, mid-40s, compact, wearing a jacket that was too light for the weather in a way that suggested he either didn't feel cold or didn't want to appear like he did. He walked without urgency. He scanned the dock the way people scan spaces when they've been trained to do it. Not dramatically, just efficiently, the eyes moving in a pattern rather than at random. He found her and changed direction without breaking stride. She didn't move toward him, she waited. He stopped 4 feet away and looked at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and is now revising it in real time based on what he's actually seeing. What he was seeing, she understood, was a woman who looked significantly more composed than her situation warranted, and that was apparently recalibrating something in his approach. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened." "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not going to perform it for you. Say what you came to say." He looked at her for another moment, assessing, not hostile. And then he put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked out at the harbor and said, "Your husband has been searching for you for 11 days. His security chief has narrowed the radius to a 40-mile coastal strip. You have, at current pace, roughly 72 hours before they have a specific address." "I know." "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. Victor Kane is very good at his job." She finally took a sip of the coffee, which was cold. "What I don't know is why the Castellano family is spending resources monitoring Damien's search operation instead of doing something more useful with the information." Soto's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the question, isn't it? It's the only question that matters right now." He turned to face her fully. In the flat harbor light, his face was easier to read. She could see the lines around his eyes, the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept cleanly in some time, and underneath that, something she hadn't expected, which was something that looked almost like discomfort. "Castellano wants to negotiate with Moretti," he said. "Has for 2 years. The territorial dispute has been expensive for both sides, and Marco Castellano is old enough now that expensive and pointless look the same to him. He sent 3 separate back-channel approaches over 18 months. Moretti rebuffed all of them. And now? And now Moretti's wife is pregnant, living alone under a false name, and nobody in the Moretti organization knows where she is except his security chief, who is conducting the search on personal rather than organizational resources." He paused. "Which means the board doesn't know, which means the organization doesn't know, which means there's a version of this where Damien Moretti is substantially more motivated to negotiate than he's ever been before." Vivian felt something cold that wasn't the harbor wind move through her chest. "You want to use me as leverage," she said. "Marco wants to use the situation as leverage," Soto said, with a precision that told her the distinction mattered to him personally, even if it didn't change the practical reality. "You wouldn't be harmed. You wouldn't even need to know it was happening. Moretti sits down at the table, the territorial dispute gets resolved, and in exchange his people stop looking for you. You get your clean break. He gets his negotiation. Everyone gets something." "And what do I get?" "You just said I get the clean break I already have. You get the guarantee that we don't sell your location to parties who are less interested in negotiation than Marco is." There it was. She'd known it was coming, had felt the shape of it from the moment she'd read the first text, but hearing it stated plainly still landed with the specific impact of a thing you've braced for but can't actually prepare for. "There are other parties," she said. "There are always other parties." He said it without apology or drama, just factual. The Moretti-Castellano tension has been a destabilizing factor in the regional structure for 4 years. Other organizations have been waiting to see who blinks first. Some of them are significantly less interested in clean resolutions than Marco is. "And you've told them about me." He hesitated for exactly 1 second. "Not yet." She turned away from him and looked out at the harbor. A gull landed on a piling 10 feet away and looked at her with the blunt incuriosity of a creature that was hungry and evaluating whether she was useful. She understood the feeling. She thought about 72 hours. She thought about Victor Kane narrowing a 40-mile radius with the systematic patience of someone who did not make mistakes. She thought about a board of directors who didn't know their boss's wife was pregnant and isolated on the Rhode Island coast, and what that information would be worth to organizations less interested in clean resolutions. She thought about the baby, 8 weeks old, entirely uninvolved in any of this, growing in the dark without any awareness that it had been born into a situation that required it to already, before it could draw a breath in open air, be used as a variable in someone else's power calculation. Something shifted in her chest, not fear. She was past the point where fear was the primary operating emotion. something colder and more structural. "I need 24 hours, she said. Soto blinked. "For what?" "To think." "Mrs. Hale?" "Claire Ashton," she said, flat. "And I need 24 hours. If Marco Castellano is serious about a negotiated resolution, 24 hours costs him nothing. If he's not, then we both know what this conversation actually was, and I'll plan accordingly." He studied her for a long moment. "You're thinking about contacting Moretti yourself." She didn't answer. "That would be 24 hours, she said. "Yes or no?" He looked at her for 3 more seconds, and she could see him doing his own calculus. What she was worth as a cooperative variable versus what she was worth as a resistant one, and which version of this produced the outcome Marco Castellano actually wanted. 24 hours, he said finally. After that, Marco makes his own decisions. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup and walked off the dock without looking back, and she kept her stride even and her face neutral all the way to the parking lot, and she got into the Civic and drove exactly 4 blocks before she pulled over, put the car in park, gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and sat there breathing through her nose until her heart rate came down from whatever altitude it had reached somewhere between other parties, and not yet. Then she put the car back in drive and went to work. She was back in her room above the hardware store by 9:15, and by 9:30 she had made a decision she would have called impossible 2 weeks ago, and now understood was the only rational move available. She was going to call Victor Kane, not Damien. Kane. She'd watched Kane operate from a careful distance for 2 years, and she had formed a specific assessment of him. A man who served Damien with complete loyalty, but who was not, at his core, a man who had abandoned his own moral architecture entirely. He had lines. She'd seen them. Small moments, easy to miss, where he'd introduced friction into a process that didn't serve what she suspected were his private convictions about acceptable conduct. She didn't trust him, but she trusted his pragmatism, which was in this instance more useful. She had his private number from a crisis protocol Damien had set up 18 months ago. A card, kept in a fireproof box in their home that she'd memorized without quite deciding to, because that was what her brain did with information. She dialed it from the prepaid phone. He answered on the first ring. "Yes? It's Vivian." She didn't pause, didn't give him time to respond because she needed to control the first 30 seconds of this call. "I'm going to tell you exactly what I know and exactly what I need, and then you're going to make a decision about whether to tell Damien I called before or after you've done what I'm asking. I don't care which, but I need you to listen first." A silence. Then, "I'm listening." She told him about Soto, about the Castellano approach, the leverage, the 72-hour window, the mention of other parties. She gave him every detail she had with the clean specificity of someone filing a report, dates, wording, the particular hesitation before not yet that she was treating as the most significant data point in the conversation. Kane was quiet for a long time when she finished. "How many people in the Castellano operation know your location?" he said. "I don't know. At minimum, Soto and whoever his support is. I don't know how high it goes." "Did he indicate whether Marco knows personally?" "He said Marco wants to negotiate. He didn't say Marco knows the location specifically." She paused. "But it doesn't matter. If Soto has it, Marco can have it in 5 minutes." "No," Kane said. "It matters. Because if Marco doesn't have a direct location yet, Soto is running a slightly more personal operation than his employer knows about, which means there are internal Castellano politics in play, which changes the calculus." Another pause, this one with the texture of someone thinking fast and carefully. "You were right to call me instead of Damien. I called you because I need this handled without it becoming an escalation that puts the baby at additional risk," she said. "I'm telling you that clearly, so we both know what the priority is." Another silence. When Kane spoke again, his voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. Something almost careful, in the way that careful means something specific when it comes from a man who is not usually required to deploy it. "He knows," Kane said, "about the baby. He's known for 11 days. He ended things with Elena the night he found out. He hasn't been running this search through the organization. It's been me, 2 people I trust, and nobody else." A pause. He's not looking for you the way he looks for things. He's looking for you the way a person looks for something they're afraid they've already lost. Vivian sat very still on the edge of the bed. She'd prepared herself for a lot of things in the past 11 days. She had not, in any version of her preparation, accounted for what it would feel like to hear that sentence. She said nothing. "I'm not asking you to go back," Kane said, reading her silence with the accuracy of someone who'd spent 30 years reading people in high-stakes moments. "I'm telling you the context because you need the full picture to make the right call about the next 24 hours. Can you neutralize the Castellano contact without escalating? If Soto is working partially off book, yes. I can apply pressure through channels that don't require Marco to be directly involved, which keeps it from becoming a formal confrontation. But I need to move on it in the next 6 hours before the 24-hour window gives Soto time to widen his net." "Do it." "And Vivian," he paused, "I need to tell him you called." She closed her eyes. Outside the window, she could hear a delivery truck pulling into the hardware store parking lot, the familiar percussion of an ordinary morning continuing its ordinary business without any awareness of the conversation happening one floor above it. "I know," she said. "Tell him whatever you need to tell him. But Kane, if he comes here, it's because I let him, not because you let him. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said, and she believed him. "Stay inside today. Don't respond to Soto until you hear from me." He hung up. She sat on the bed with the dead phone in her hands and the delivery truck moving below her window, and the particular quality of silence that follows a decision you can't unmake. And she pressed one hand flat against her stomach. Not dramatically, not consciously, just the way your hand moves toward the thing that matters most when everything else feels like it's in motion. And she sat there until her breathing evened out. Kane called Damien at 10:04 a.m. He delivered the information in the order of operational importance rather than emotional impact, because that was the professional thing to do, and because he understood that Damien would absorb it more cleanly that way. The Castellano contact first, Soto's probable partial autonomy, the 6-hour window, the plan of interdiction. Then at the end, without preamble, she called me. She gave me all of it, and she told me to move. She asked me to tell you. Damien was quiet for so long that Kane almost checked the line. "She called you," he said finally. "Yes. To protect the baby. That was her stated priority." "Yes." Another silence. "She's in Harwick." It wasn't a question. Kane had never told him the town. He'd been maintaining the operational separation Damien had requested. Personal resources only, location held close. He understood now that Damien had worked it out himself, had been sitting on the probability for days without applying the pressure to confirm it, waiting for something he couldn't have named as permission. "Yes," Kane said. "Handle Soto. I'll handle the rest." "She said if you come, it's because she let you." A pause. "I understand." "Damien." Kane hesitated. This was the other thing, the part he'd been holding since this morning, since he'd made a second call after hanging up with Vivian, a call that had nothing to do with Soto or the Castellano family. "There's something else. Something I found this morning when I was pulling the Castellano communication records to establish Soto's contact history." "Say it." "Soto didn't find her location through external surveillance of our search operation." He kept his voice level because the information was explosive enough without adding anything to it. "He found it through an internal source. Someone inside the Moretti organization has been feeding information to the Castellano family, not just about Vivian, about the pregnancy, about your movements during the search, about the fact that you were running the operation personally and off board." He paused. "Whoever it is has been active for at minimum 4 months, possibly longer." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the previous ones. It was the silence of a man who has just had the floor of his understanding shift underneath him and is taking the half-second required to find his footing. "You have candidates," Damien said. 3. I haven't moved on any of them because I needed to tell you first and because moving prematurely burns the evidence trail." "Send me what you have." "Already done. It's in the secure file." A pause. "Damien, one of the 3 is someone you're going to find very difficult to believe." "Who?" Kane said the name. The silence that came back was total and long and absolute, and Kane sat in it without filling it, because some things needed their full weight before they could be responded to. "Are you certain?" Damien said. His voice had gone somewhere very quiet. 90%. I need 2 more hours to get to certainty." "Get to certainty," Damien said. "Then sit on it until I get back. Nobody moves on this without me in the room." "Understood. And Damien—" Kane paused. "I'm sorry. About which name it is." The line went dead. Damien was in his car in 11 minutes and driving northeast in 20, and the name Kane had just said to him was sitting in the passenger seat like a physical object, dense and wrong-shaped, the kind of thing you keep glancing at because some part of you is still hoping it'll look different from a new angle. It didn't look different. He drove with his hands loose on the wheel and his jaw tight, and the landscape of Connecticut rolling past his windows in the flat gray light of a November morning. And he thought about 4 months of conversations, 4 months of operational decisions, made in the presence of someone he'd trusted with access to information that was now apparently in the hands of an organization that had just tried to use his unborn child as a negotiating chip. He thought about everything that person had been in the room for. Every meeting, every call, every moment where Kane had briefed him on the progress of the search, and the person in question had been there, listening, with the particular quality of attention that he'd always read as loyalty and was now being required to reinterpret as something else entirely. 90%, Kane had said. 90% was a confession in everything but name. He drove for 40 minutes and then pulled off onto a coastal road because the GPS had put him 12 minutes from a harbor town in Rhode Island, and his chest was doing something complicated that he didn't have vocabulary for, something that was a long way from the cold operational clarity he needed, but was apparently what he had available. He thought about the audio from his office. She's useful. That's different from mattering. He thought about 4 minutes of security footage. A woman in a gray dress turning around in a hallway with a white box in her arms. He thought about what it cost a person to build a floor under themselves, quietly, over years, without anyone noticing, because they understood at some fundamental level that they might need it. He parked a block from the address Kane had sent him and sat in the car for 2 minutes, looking at the hardware store, ordinary, peeling paint on the sign, a delivery truck pulling away from the loading bay, and the windows above it, and the thin strip of harbor visible at the end of the street, and he thought, she chose this town because of the water. He didn't know how he knew that, he just did. He got out of the car. He walked to the door at the side of the building and stood in front of it and raised his hand to knock. And before his knuckles made contact, the door opened, because she'd heard the car, or heard his footsteps on the wooden stairs, or had some other sense he'd never given her credit for. And she was standing in the doorway in jeans and a gray sweater, with her hair loose and her face carrying 11 days of choices he hadn't been part of. And she looked at him the way you look at something that has caused you extensive damage and that you are not, even now, entirely capable of hating. "I told Kane to tell you it was my decision," she said. "He told me," Damien said. "It was yours." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. He walked in. The room was small and simply furnished, and through the window at the far end he could see the harbor. Just a strip of it, gray-green water and a slice of sky. And on the kitchen table there was a cold cup of tea and a packet of saltine crackers and a small white box with a yellow ribbon, still tied, that she had apparently brought with her when she ran. He looked at the box. He looked at her. "There's a traitor in your organization," she said, before he could find whatever words he'd been driving for an hour trying to locate. "And someone named Soto knows where I am and has 23 hours left on a window he gave me. And if you're here, then Kane is handling the Castellano end, but there's still whoever's been feeding them information for 4 months. And that person knows about the baby, and knows you've been searching. And that means we are not safe here." She said all of it in one even breath, because she was a woman who led with function when emotion was a resource she needed to ration. "So whatever you came here to say it fast, and then we need to figure out where we go." He stood in the middle of the room and looked at his wife, who had built herself a floor and used it, who had run with perfect discipline and imperfect heartbreak, who was standing in front of him with crackers on the table and his child growing inside her, and a yellow ribboned box she hadn't been able to leave behind, and he said the only true thing he had. "I came to tell you I'm sorry. The rest can wait." He paused. "But you're right about the rest." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she picked up the prepaid phone from the counter. "Kane found the mole," she said. "Who is it?" Damien told her. The name hit her the way he'd known it would. A visible impact, there and then controlled, her face doing something complicated for exactly 2 seconds before it went still again. She set the phone down carefully. "He was in your office the morning I came," she said. Not a question. Working it out the way she worked everything out, backward from the conclusion, checking every connection. "Yes," Damien said. "So he knew I was there. He would have seen the footage before Kane." Damien hadn't thought of that yet. The implication landed hard, that the person who had been feeding the Castellano family for 4 months might have known, before anyone else in the organization, that Vivian had come and gone in 4 minutes, and might have understood immediately what that meant, and might have made a calculation in that moment about how useful that information was going to be. "We need to go," Vivian said. She was already moving toward the small closet where a single bag was packed, clearly packed, because she'd maintained readiness without ever fully believing she wouldn't need it. "Where's your safe house?" "Western Massachusetts, 4 hours." "Does the mole know about it?" He thought about it. Went through every conversation, every briefing. "No, it's not in any file he had access to." "Then that's where we go." She pulled the bag out and looked at him with an expression that contained everything. The 11 days, the 42nd floor, the harbor, the crackers, the box. And none of it resolved, none of it finished. All of it simply present the way serious things are present when you've decided to be a person who doesn't look away from them. "And Damien," her voice dropped half a register. "When we get there, we're going to have the conversation, the real one, not the operational one." "I know," he said. She picked up the white box from the table and put it in her bag. They walked out together into the cold Rhode Island morning, and behind them the harbor moved against its pilings with the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. And ahead of them the road ran west through the flat gray light toward a reckoning that neither of them had a map for. And somewhere inside the Moretti organization, a man who had called himself loyal was about to discover that the most dangerous thing he'd ever done was underestimate the woman he'd helped to run. The safe house was a farmhouse set back from a county road in western Massachusetts, 200 yards of gravel driveway separating it from the nearest through line, surrounded on 3 sides by second-growth forest that had been growing long enough to be serious about it. Kane had acquired it through 4 layers of intermediary 18 months ago for exactly this kind of purpose. A place that existed in no file, no database, no conversation that anyone outside his immediate circle had ever been part of. They arrived at 2:40 p.m. Damien killed the headlights at the end of the driveway and let the car roll the last 50 yards on momentum, an old habit that had no specific tactical justification in this moment, but that his body performed automatically when the threat level crossed a certain threshold. Vivian noticed. She noticed everything he was understanding, had always noticed everything, had simply chosen for 2 years to file most of it under a category she hadn't named for him. The house was cold inside. Kane had called ahead to one of his 2 trusted people, a woman named Dara, who said almost nothing and anticipated almost everything. And she'd turned the heat on 2 hours before their arrival, but the bones of the place held cold the way old houses do, the walls still carrying the temperature of the empty weeks before. Vivian walked through the main room without speaking, checking the windows by habit, reading the space the way she'd read every space for the past 11 days. He watched her do it and said nothing. She was wearing her coat still, the bag over one shoulder, and she moved with the slightly deliberate quality of someone managing physical discomfort without advertising it. The nausea, he realized, remembering the saltines on the table, the way she'd eaten 2 of them in the car without explanation during the first hour of the drive. He'd wanted to say something then. He hadn't found anything that wasn't either too small or too large for the moment. She stopped at the window that faced the driveway and looked out at the gravel and the tree line beyond it, and the flat gray afternoon light that made the whole landscape look like something that had been drained of color on purpose. "How long before Kane moves on Marcus?" she said. Marcus Hale. Her cousin. The name still sat wrong in Damien's mouth, carrying the specific wrongness of a betrayal that had weaponized something he hadn't expected anyone to have access to. Proximity, affection, the particular trust you extend to family without running it through the same filters you apply to everyone else. Marcus Hale, who had introduced himself to Damien at a company dinner 3 years ago as Vivian's cousin, charming and sharp, and apparently delighted by his cousin's marriage into a world that was significantly more interesting than his previous life. Marcus Hale, who had parlayed that introduction into a junior advisory position in the Moretti financial structure, citing qualifications that Kane had verified, and Damien had approved because he was Vivian's family, and Vivian's family had seemed, at the time, like a category that didn't require the same scrutiny as everything else. 4 months of feeding. 4 months of selected information passed in careful portions to a Castellano contact, not enough to damage the organization catastrophically, because that would have been obvious, but enough to give the Castellano family consistent, actionable intelligence. And when Vivian had run, Marcus had understood immediately what it meant, had seen the security footage before Kane, had calculated the value of a pregnant woman alone on the coast, and had opened a new channel to Soto inside of 48 hours. 2 hours, Damien said. He wants certainty before he moves. He has certainty. He told you 90% this morning. He has it now. He called me 40 minutes ago. Damien set his jacket on the back of a chair. He's waiting for me to be in position before he makes contact. He doesn't want Marcus to have any window to communicate outward before we control the information. Vivian turned from the window. Marcus is going to know you're here. If he's been tracking the search operation, he'll know you drove to Rhode Island this morning. Yes. He'll know I called Kane. Probably. Which means he knows the Castellano channel is blown. She looked at him with the flat, analytical clarity that he was still recalibrating his understanding of. This was what she'd been doing for 2 years, he was realizing, this precise, unsentimental intelligence, and he'd categorized it as composure when it was actually something that had nothing to do with composure at all. He's going to move first. He can't afford to wait. Damien's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Kane. He answered immediately. Talk. Marcus made contact with Soto 11 minutes ago. Kane's voice was flat and fast, the voice he used when the situation had accelerated past the planned timeline. He's told Soto that the safe house location exists. He doesn't have the specific address, but he's given Soto enough about the acquisition method that Soto's people can potentially reverse engineer it through the intermediary chain. I need to move on Marcus now, and Damien. Soto's not waiting for the 24-hour window. He's already made calls. To who? I have 3 names. 2 are Castellano internal. 1 isn't. A pause. The 3rd contact is Brennan Vey. The name dropped into the room like something heavy. Vivian saw his face change. Who is Brennan Vey? She said. He held up one finger. Give me a second. And said into the phone, how fast can Vey move if Soto gave him this address? If he already had the address, 6 hours. But Soto doesn't have it yet. Marcus doesn't have it. The intermediary chain has 4 nodes, and the 2nd node is a company Kane created, which means you control the information flow. I control whether the chain completes, Kane said. If I cut the 2nd node in the next 30 minutes, Soto's people hit a wall. They'd have to start over with a different approach, and that buys us 12 to 18 hours. Cut it. Already done. But Damien, Vey's involvement changes this. He's not interested in negotiation. He's been looking for a direct move against you for 2 years, and Marcus just handed him a vector. Handle Marcus, Damien said. I'll handle Vey. You can't negotiate with Vey the way you can with Marco Castellano. They don't want a territorial agreement. They want... I know what they want. He kept his voice level, which took more than usual. Handle Marcus. Bring him to me here. I want him in this room. And Victor. A pause. Don't let him make any calls between your door and mine. Understood. He hung up. Vivian was looking at him with an expression that had crossed some threshold from analytical into something raw. Brennan Vey, she said again. Competitor. Not Mafia in the traditional structure, more decentralized, more violent, less interested in the kind of institutional stability that makes negotiation possible. He looked at her directly because she deserved that. He's been trying to find a direct pressure point against me for 24 months. If Soto brought him in, it means the Castellano play was never purely about negotiation. Someone inside the Castellano family has been running a parallel agenda. Soto, he confirmed. Marcus didn't just feed information to the Castellano family. He fed it to a specific person inside that family who has been using it to build a coalition. She sat down on the edge of the couch and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum. Not dramatically, just the gesture of someone managing a physical response to information that keeps getting worse. So the threat isn't one organization. It's a loose coalition that Soto's been assembling using the intelligence Marcus gave him. Yes, and the leverage point holding it together is me. He didn't answer, because the answer was yes, and saying it out loud felt like the worst thing he'd done in a day that was full of bad options. She looked up at him. Sit down, Damien. You're making me anxious standing there. He sat. The room was quiet for a moment, the heat ticking through the baseboards, the wind moving through the trees outside, the particular quality of silence that accumulates in a house that has been empty for a long time. I need to know what you're going to do about Vey, she said. I'm going to negotiate with Marco Castellano directly. Tonight, if possible. She frowned. Marco's your entry point. If Soto has been running a private agenda inside the Castellano structure, Marco might not know the full extent of it. That's what I'm counting on. Marco is old school. He doesn't sanction using civilians, especially pregnant women, as operational leverage. If I can get to Marco directly and show him exactly what Soto built using Castellano resources, the coalition falls apart from the inside. He kept his voice even. Vey loses his intelligence pipeline. Soto loses his cover. And Marcus... He stopped. What happens to Marcus? She said. He looked at her. I'm asking, she said. Not because I'm going to argue with you, because I need to know what kind of world my daughter is being born into. The word daughter hit him somewhere beneath the sternum with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its size. 2 syllables. He hadn't known it was a girl. Kane hadn't told him that detail. She must have found out at the prenatal appointment. She'd been carrying that for 10 days alone. He'll be removed from every structure associated with me, Damien said carefully. He'll be cut off from the network completely. What he does with whatever's left of his life after that is up to him. He paused. I'm not going to hurt him, Vivian. He's your family. She looked at him for a long moment. He stopped being my family when he used my pregnancy to build a leverage portfolio. That doesn't change what I said. She turned away. Not angry. Processing. He was learning to read the difference, which was something he should have learned 2 years ago and hadn't. Call Marco, she said. Marco Castellano was 71 years old, and he answered his private line on the 3rd ring with the unhurried quality of a man who had stopped being surprised by phone calls at inconvenient hours, sometime in the mid-90s. Damien didn't preamble. He laid out what he had. Soto's operation, the coalition, Vey's involvement, the specific intelligence Marcus had been providing, and the manner in which it had been used, in 10 minutes of clean, factual language, and then he stopped and let Marco be quiet for as long as he needed. Marco was quiet for almost a full minute. You have documentation, Marco said. His voice was the voice of a man controlling something at significant cost. Kane has everything. I can have it to you in 20 minutes. Do that. A pause. Rafael Soto has been with my organization for 9 years. I know. He was going to be my successor. I know that too. Another silence. The woman, your wife. She's safe? She's with me. Good. Marco's voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, but more direct. The particular directness of someone who has just had a window open onto something they find genuinely unacceptable. I didn't authorize any of this. I want you to understand that clearly. I do. The negotiation I wanted, the territorial resolution, that offer is still on the table. On my table, not Raphael's. A pause that had weight in it. I'll handle Raphael. There's also Vey. Vey was Raphael's addition. He's not my problem, and he's not my alliance. Marco's voice went dry in a way that communicated a very specific contempt. Brennan Vey is a man who mistakes chaos for leverage. He has no structure that survives direct pressure. If his coalition loses its intelligence source, he has nothing. Which is what happens when you handle Soto. Yes. A pause. Moretti, I want a meeting. In person. Neutral location, no staff, just you and me. This territorial problem has cost both our operations 4 years of unnecessary friction, and I'm too old to spend another 4 years on it. Damien looked across the room at Vivian, who was watching him with her arms crossed and her face doing that thing it did when she was reading subtext in real time. Next week, Damien said. Once my house is in order. Next week, Marco agreed. Send me Kane's documentation. The line went dead. Damien lowered the phone. Vivian looked at him. Well, she said. Soto's finished. Vey loses the coalition when Marco pulls the Castellano backing. It collapses in 48 hours. She nodded slowly. The tension in her posture didn't disappear. It shifted, redistributed, the way tension does when one specific threat resolves and the larger, older, more personal ones reassert themselves in the space it leaves behind. A car on the gravel. Damien was at the window in 4 steps. Dara's vehicle, Kane's person, and behind it a second car, Kane's own. He exhaled. Marcus is here, he said. Vivian stood. She straightened her sweater. She did something with her face that he couldn't entirely interpret, a settling, a preparation. And then she said, I want to be in the room. Vivian, he used my pregnancy, she said. He used me. I want to be in the room. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Okay. Marcus Hale looked smaller than Damien remembered. That was the first thing. The specific diminishment that happens to people when the architecture of their deception is removed and what's left is just the person underneath it. He was 34, lean, with Vivian's same dark eyes and a quality of alertness that Damien now understood he'd been reading as intelligence when it was actually something more like surveillance. He'd been reading the room, every room, for 4 months. Dara brought him in with one hand loosely at his elbow, not forceful, just present. And Kane came in behind and closed the door, and Marcus stood in the middle of the farmhouse living room and looked at Vivian, and something moved across his face that Damien couldn't name and didn't try to. Vivian looked at her cousin the way you look at something you thought you knew the shape of and have just discovered you were measuring wrong. Sit down, Marcus, she said. He sat. Kane took a position near the door. Dara moved to the window. Damien stayed standing. The only person in the room projecting anything like calm was Vivian, who had sat down across from Marcus and was looking at him with an expression so level it was almost clinical. How long? She said. Marcus looked at his hands. Viv, don't. Her voice didn't rise. That was somehow worse. How long were you feeding them? A pause. 4 months. What did you give them? He looked up at that, and she held his gaze without giving him anything to work with. He looked back down. Financial movement patterns. The search operation timeline. When Damien went off board with the resources. He swallowed. The pregnancy. I gave them the pregnancy. The room was very quiet. Why? She said. He pressed his mouth together. For a moment, Damien thought he was going to try something, an explanation, a justification, the architecture of rationalization that people construct when they've done something they can't otherwise live with. Then something in Marcus collapsed, some internal structure giving way, and what was left on his face was just the bare thing underneath all of it. They came to me, he said, 8 months ago, before any of this. They knew about my debts. I had exposure I hadn't told anyone about, bad decisions, compounding interest, the kind of thing that gets away from you. He stopped. They said they'd clear it. All of it, everything, in exchange for access. And you said yes, Vivian said. I said yes. You said yes, she repeated. Not enraged, not broken, just making sure the sentence existed in the room with its full weight. And when I ran, when you saw the footage and you understood what had happened to me, You called Soto within 48 hours and you told him where I was. I didn't have your location yet. You gave him enough to find it, she said, which is the same thing. She leaned forward very slightly. I was alone, Marcus. I was pregnant and alone, and building something out of nothing, and you handed my address to a man who was going to use my unborn child as a negotiating chip. A pause. Did you know about Vay? Marcus flinched, which was its own answer. Yes, he said very quietly. Vivian sat back. She pressed her palm flat against the arm of the chair, and she looked at her cousin, at the person she'd known since they were children, at the family she'd carried as a constant in a life that had very few constants, and she let herself feel the full weight of what he'd done for exactly 5 seconds. Then she looked at Damien. He tells Kane everything, she said. Every contact, every communication, everything he gave them, and everything they gave him. All of it. She stood up. And then, I don't want to see him again. She walked to the hallway that led to the back of the house, and she didn't look at Marcus again, and Marcus sat in the chair with his hands open on his knees, and the look of someone who had expected punishment and received something worse than that. The specific, total withdrawal of a person who loved you deciding simply to stop. Kane looked at Damien. Damien looked at the hallway. Start talking, Kane said to Marcus. It took 2 hours. Damien sat in the kitchen while Kane and Dara worked Marcus through every detail in the living room, and he listened to the information come out in pieces. Names, dates, specific communications, the structure of what Soto had built using Marcus as the central node, and he cataloged it with the part of his mind that never fully stopped running logistics. And he did this because it was necessary, and because the alternative was sitting in the kitchen of a farmhouse in Massachusetts, thinking about his daughter and what she was going to inherit from the world he'd built. And that was a thought with dimensions he wasn't ready to stand inside yet. At some point, Vivian appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of tea. She set one in front of him without comment and sat down across the table and wrapped both hands around her own cup. They sat like that for a while. Not in silence exactly. There were voices from the living room, the wind in the trees, the heat ticking, but in the particular absence of speech that happens between 2 people who have too much to say and are each waiting for the other to find the door into it. I heard some of what Kane asked him, she said finally. It's mostly what we expected. Not all of it. She looked at her tea. The debt Soto cleared. It was mine. Marcus had co-signed something for me when I was 26 before I met you, a business loan that went badly. I thought it had been settled years ago. A pause. It hadn't. Soto found it. He cleared a debt that had my name on it, which means he knew that Marcus would feel like he was protecting me. She looked up. He was protecting me in his own broken version of what that means. He thought he could contain it. He thought it wouldn't reach me. Damien looked at her. Does that change what he did? No, she said, but it changes how I understand it. She looked at her hands on the cup. I'm good at understanding things. It's not always an advantage. He thought about a lot of things in that moment. He thought about the 42nd floor and the audio he'd stopped before it finished. He thought about 8 months of careful distance he'd called professionalism. He thought about the word useful and how it had seemed, in the moment he'd said it, to be a perfectly accurate description and not the worst thing he'd ever done. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. Not as an explanation, he said. Not as a defense of anything I did. Just because you should know it. He kept his voice level, which cost him more than the 2 hours of logistics had. I heard myself on that recording, what I said about you. He stopped, found it again. I've been thinking about the version of me that said that for 11 days, trying to understand how a person gets to a point where they describe someone they married as useful. What that requires a person to do to themselves. He looked at her directly. I don't have a sufficient answer. I just wanted you to know that I've been sitting with it, that I'm not looking for a way around it. The kitchen was very quiet. I know, she said. And then, more quietly, that's the first thing you've said to me in 2 years that felt completely true. He looked at the table, then at her. I'm going to need a lot of time to trust anything you say, she said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I don't want you to expect otherwise. I'm not expecting anything. And I'm not going back to New York, not to that life. I know. Do you? She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who is offering you exactly one opportunity to be honest. Because knowing it in a safe house when everything is burning is different from knowing it when the fire's out and the old structures are still standing and it would be easier to let things go back to what they were. I know the difference, he said. Prove it, she said, simply, without drama. His phone rang. He looked at it. Kane's number. He answered. Soto just moved, Kane said, and his voice had the quality it got when the situation had shifted faster than the plan. He didn't wait for Marco to reach him. He's made direct contact with Vey, and he's given him an alternate approach to the intermediary chain, not the one I cut, a secondary route I didn't know he had. Damien, they may have a location in less than 6 hours. Damien was already standing. How certain? 80%. The secondary route goes through a logistics company in Providence that I have no leverage over. If they complete the trace, can you intercept at the Providence node? I need 40 minutes, and I need you to make a call to a man named Reyes who runs the company. He owes you a favor from 2019, and he'll listen to you where he won't listen to me. Send me the number. Already sent. Damien, if this doesn't work, Vey has a 4-man team in the region. He's not interested in negotiation. If he gets this address, he won't get it, Damien said. Make your move. I'll have Reyes in 5 minutes. He hung up and looked at Vivian, who had heard enough to understand the shape of what was happening and was already on her feet with the particular readiness of someone who had been in a state of readiness for 11 days and had simply been waiting for the next thing to require it. How bad, she said. Contained. Maybe. He was already pulling up the number Kane had sent. I need to make one call that closes this. And if it doesn't close? He looked at her. If the call doesn't close it, she said, and Veg's people get this location, what do we do? He thought about 4 men with no interest in negotiation, and a farmhouse with 1 exit road, and a woman who was 10 weeks pregnant and a daughter he hadn't held yet, and he thought about what he was willing to do and what he was willing to lose and where those 2 things intersected. We leave, he said. Right now, tonight, before the window closes. There's a secondary location Kane doesn't communicate through any channel. It's in my head only, no documentation anywhere. If the Providence call fails, we're in the car in 5 minutes. She looked at him for 1 second. Make the call. He dialed. Reyes answered on the second ring, and Damien spoke for 90 seconds without pause. Clean, direct, the specific language of a man calling in something real. And Reyes was quiet on the other end, and then Reyes said 3 words that were the most important 3 words in the conversation. He hung up. Vivian was watching him. It's done, he said. The Providence node is locked. Soto's secondary route ends there. She let out a breath she'd been holding since Kane's call. A small, controlled release, barely audible, but he heard it. Vague, she said, loses his intelligence pipeline completely when Marco moves on Soto. He has no independent sourcing, no coalition without Castellano backing, no move. He set the phone on the table. It's over. The operational piece of this is over. The kitchen was quiet again. Outside, the wind had picked up in the trees. The light through the window was going toward evening, the sky moving through shades of gray that deepened as he watched. And in the middle of all of it, in the middle of 2 hours of Marcus and Kane and Marco and Reyes and Soto and the entire dismantled architecture of a 4-month betrayal, Vivian was standing in a farmhouse kitchen in western Massachusetts, looking at him with an expression that had nothing in it anymore that was protecting itself. You gave up the negotiating position with Castellano, she said. You used it to end the threat. You could have kept it, the leverage, the information advantage, and used it to strengthen the organization's position in the territorial dispute. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he'd been unable to find a memory of doing in the hours he'd spent at that Manhattan window. And he let the answer be what it actually was instead of what it would have been 6 months ago. Because the organization isn't what I'm trying to protect anymore, he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she sat back down at the kitchen table, wrapped her hands around her cup of tea and said, We still need to have the conversation. I know, he said. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I'm too tired and you're too wired and we'll do it badly, but soon, before anything else gets decided. Whatever you need." She looked at him over the rim of the cup, and what was in her eyes was not forgiveness. He understood that clearly, understood that forgiveness was not a thing that arrived in a farmhouse kitchen after one afternoon of crisis management, but something more primary than forgiveness, something that preceded it in the sequence of what became possible between people who had broken something real. She was looking at him like he was still worth looking at. For now, in the cooling kitchen with the wind in the Massachusetts trees and his daughter, 10 weeks old and entirely unaware that the world had just rearranged itself around her, that was enough to be going on with. His phone buzzed one more time. He looked at the screen. "Kane. Marcus gave us one more name. You need to see this before morning." He stared at it. Vivian watched his face change. "What?" she said. He turned the phone so she could read it, and she read it, and the color left her face in a slow, precise way that told him she understood exactly what it meant and exactly how much further the floor had just dropped beneath everything they thought they'd finished. The name on Kane's message was Elena Vasquez. Vivian read it twice. Then she set the phone on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone putting down something that might break if handled wrong, and she looked at the middle distance for a moment. Not at Damien, not at anything in the room, just at the space where the information was still settling into its final shape. She knew about the pregnancy, Vivian said. Not a question. Marcus must have told her. Damien was already thinking through the architecture of it, the specific way this changed what he thought he'd understood about the last 4 months. They overlapped. Marcus had access to the organization's financial layer. Elena had access to my schedule, my meetings, my private communications. Together they were a complete picture, Vivian said. One of them had the money, one of them had the movements. Between them, Soto had everything he needed. She picked the phone back up and read Kane's message again, this time more slowly. Then she set it down and looked at Damien with an expression he couldn't fully read. It wasn't anger, it wasn't grief. It was something more like the face a person makes when a proof they've been working through finally resolves, and the answer is exactly as bad as they suspected it might be. She was in the office that day, Vivian said, when I came. Yes. She knew I was there. She would have known I could hear. She paused. Do you think she knew I was outside the door? He thought about it honestly, which was the only thing he could offer her. He thought about Elena's particular quality of awareness, the efficiency he'd read as professional excellence, the attentiveness he'd read as dedication. And he thought about a woman who had been passing information to a third party for 4 months, and who would have understood, better than almost anyone, the operational value of a wife who overheard something and ran. I don't know, he said. I can't tell you, I'm certain she didn't. Vivian absorbed that. Meaning the scene I walked into, she said slowly, might not have been accidental. The kitchen was so quiet he could hear the wind finding gaps in the old window frames. It's possible, he said. It's also possible it was exactly what it looked like, 2 people who had stopped being careful. And Marcus and Elena were running separate operations that happened to converge. He kept his voice even, because the alternative was something he didn't have a right to right now. I don't have certainty either way. I'm telling you what I have. She looked at him for a long time. I need Kane to find out, she said. I need to know whether I walked into that hallway by chance or whether someone calculated that I would. She paused. Because those are 2 very different things to live with. I'll have him find out. Tonight. Tonight, he confirmed. She stood up and walked to the window over the kitchen sink and looked out at the dark Massachusetts tree line, and he watched her stand there with her arms crossed and her reflection ghosted in the glass beside the dark outside, and he thought about what it cost a person to keep standing up straight under the weight of information that kept arriving in worse increments than the last. He called Kane. Elena, he said when Kane answered. I know, Kane said. I'm already in it. Give me 2 hours. 1. A pause. 1.5. And Damien, I need you to know that if this goes where I think it goes, the conversation you have with me after is going to be the hardest one of tonight, and tonight has not been easy. Handle it. Call me when you have it. He set the phone down. Vivian was still at the window. You ended things with her by phone, she said. The night you found out about the baby. Yes. Did she say anything? He thought about the call, the brevity of it, the quality of Elena's silence before she'd said his name, that single syllable that had contained something he'd registered at the time as hurt and was now required to reinterpret through a different lens entirely. She said my name, that was all. That was all, Vivian repeated. Yes. She turned from the window. Go check that Dara's secured the perimeter. I need 10 minutes alone. He went. Kabah. He walked the perimeter of the farmhouse with Dara, who communicated in monosyllables and complete competence. And he looked at the dark tree line and the gravel driveway and the empty county road beyond it, and he breathed the cold Massachusetts air and thought about a woman he'd trusted with his schedule and his silence for 3 years, and what she might or might not have done with a hallway and a partially open door. He thought about the specific cruelty of uncertainty, of not knowing whether the worst moment of his wife's life had been engineered or accidental, and understanding that even if it was accidental, he was the reason she'd been in that hallway at all. Dara said, Kane's on, and held out her phone. He took it. She knew, Kane said. There was no preamble because there was no version of this that benefited from softening. I found the communication record. She texted Soto 11 minutes before Vivian arrived that day. She'd been tracking Vivian's car through a GPS tag she'd placed on the vehicle 8 months ago. I found the purchase record. A pause. She knew Vivian was coming. She knew approximately when she'd arrive, and she knew what Vivian would hear if she stopped outside the office door. Damien stood in the cold dark outside the farmhouse and felt something move through him that was beyond anger, something older and more fundamental. The specific sensation of understanding that a betrayal was larger than you'd measured it, and that the measurement kept expanding. She staged it, he said. She didn't stage your behavior, Kane said quietly. That part was yours, but she arranged the audience for it. He stood with that for a moment. She wanted Vivian to run, he said. She wanted you available, Kane said, and she wanted the leverage that came from knowing where Vivian went. She fed the pregnancy information to Soto 2 days after she learned about it from Marcus. The GPS data let her confirm Vivian's location in Harwick before Marcus ever made his call. Another pause. She's been the primary source, Damien. Marcus was secondary. Elena was running point on this from the beginning. He was quiet for a long time. Where is she now? Her apartment in the city. She doesn't know we have any of this. She would have expected Marcus to protect her as part of protecting himself. He didn't. Kane's voice was careful. She's not going anywhere. I have eyes on the building. What do you want me to do? Sit on her until morning. Don't move. Don't make contact. I'll tell you when. He gave Dara her phone back and stood in the cold for another minute, looking at nothing in particular, breathing slowly through his nose until the thing moving through his chest settled into something he could carry back inside without letting it arrive on his face before he'd had time to decide how to give it to Vivian. He went back in. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the saltine crackers, and the look of someone who had used the 10 minutes well, had taken whatever she needed to take apart and put back together, and had done it efficiently, because that was how she was built. She looked at him when he came in and read his face immediately. Tell me, she said. He sat down. He told her all of it. The GPS tag, the text to Soto, the timing, the calculation behind a partially open door on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He told it cleanly, without editorializing, because she didn't need his emotional response layered over the facts. She needed the facts, and then she could form her own response in her own way. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds. Exactly 30, he counted, not deliberately, just the way the mind counts things when it's trying to stay inside its own body. She put a tracking device on my car, Vivian said, 8 months ago. 8 months ago, I was still trying to make this marriage work, she said. I was still choosing to weigh what you did against what you said. I was still cooking the books. She looked at her water glass. And she was already running the operation. Yes. The day I came to tell you about the baby, the best day I'd had in 8 months, she knew I was coming. She knew what you'd say if she put herself in the right position, and she let it happen. A pause. She used our daughter before our daughter existed. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and he was finally, at great cost, learning the difference between adequate and true. Vivian picked up a saltine and ate it in 2 bites with the mechanical practicality of someone managing nausea and not interested in acknowledging it. Then she looked at him. "What happens to her?" she said. "That depends on you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want her completely removed from every structure associated with you or the organization. I want the GPS surveillance documented and reported, not to your people, to actual law enforcement. The device on my car is criminal under Connecticut statute. I want her to have a legal problem that has nothing to do with the Moretti name, something that exists in the real world that she has to answer for in a courtroom." She paused. "I don't want her hurt. I want her accountable. Those are different things." "I can do that." "I know you can." She looked at her hands. "That's what I want. Not because I'm merciful, because I'm tired of watching things happen in the dark where no one has to answer for them." He looked at her. "Including what happened between us," she said. "That's in the dark too, Damien. 2 years of it." "I know. We said we'd have the conversation. We said soon. It's been a long night." "It has." She looked at the window, at the black glass and the tree line beyond it. "But I've been having it in my head for 11 days and I need it to exist out loud, between us, even if we're both exhausted. Because I need to know what we're actually deciding here before I spend another night under a roof that has your name on it." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Ask me whatever you need to ask." She looked at him, really looked at him, with the same complete, unguarded directness she'd deployed in the car on the drive up, in the kitchen over tea, and in every moment tonight where the operational noise had quieted long enough for the real thing to surface. "Did you ever love me?" she said. "Not want me, not find me useful. Love me, the way it's supposed to mean." The question sat between them with all its weight. He thought about the careful, honest answer, the one that required him to look directly at the version of himself that had said those words in his office and understand what it revealed. Not just about that moment, but about the accumulated choices that had produced it. "I think I loved the idea of you more than I knew how to love the actual person," he said, "in the beginning. And I think I told myself that was the same thing for long enough that I stopped checking." He paused. "What I feel when I think about you leaving, what I feel right now in this room, is not what I feel about losing something useful. I don't have a cleaner answer than that. I know it's not enough." She looked at him for a long time. "No," she said, "it's not enough." And then, more quietly, "But it's the first true thing you've said about us. So, that's something." The kitchen was very still. "I'm not coming back to the old life," she said. "That's not a negotiating position, it's just what's true. The penthouse, the events, the careful distance, and the useful wife. That life is finished, and I don't want it back even if you offered it." "I'm not offering it." "What are you offering?" He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved, which meant not reaching for the easy answer, the one that sounded right in a difficult moment but would dissolve under the ordinary pressure of an ordinary Tuesday. "I'm offering to find out what I'm capable of being when I'm not measuring everything by what it produces," he said. "I don't know what that looks like yet. I know it doesn't look like what the last 2 years looked like." He paused. "And I'm offering to be here. For her. Whatever that requires and however long it takes for you to decide what you need it to look like." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the tree line was just dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky. And somewhere in the distance, there was the sound of a car on the county road, moving past without stopping. "Okay," she said, "just that. Not a resolution, not forgiveness, not a plan, not a declaration. Just the specific small word that means, I hear you, and I'm not done yet, and we can continue." It was, he understood, the most honest thing either of them had said to each other in 2 years. Kane arrived at the farmhouse at 7 a.m. with coffee and a folder, and the particular appearance of a man who had not slept, and had made peace with that fact some hours ago. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Damien and opened the folder and walked through the remaining operational pieces with the clean efficiency of someone closing out an account. Elena Vasquez had been documented. The GPS device evidence had been packaged and delivered through a legitimate channel to a Connecticut state investigator Kane had a relationship with, not a Moretti relationship, a clean one, the kind built on actual professional respect. She would have a legal problem by Monday morning that had nothing to do with organized crime and everything to do with a tracking device and a violation of privacy statute. Marco Castellano had received Kane's documentation at midnight. His response had arrived at 3 a.m. 3 sentences, formal, in the specific register of a man who understood that brevity was the appropriate language for serious things. Soto was being removed. The Castellano-Moretti territorial negotiation would proceed at a neutral location within 30 days. The matter of Brennan Vey was described, with elegant economy, as already handled, a phrase Kane interpreted to mean that Vey had been informed, through whatever channel Marco used for such communications, that his coalition had no remaining foundation and that pursuing it further would constitute a personal offense against the Castellano name. Vey, as Marco had assessed, was a man who mistook chaos for leverage. Without the coalition, without the intelligence pipeline, without Castellano backing, he had nothing. He would calculate the math and find somewhere else to apply his energy. And Marcus, Damien said. Kane looked at him. He's at a hotel 2 miles from here. Dara's with him. A pause. He gave us everything voluntarily. All of it. Every contact, every communication, every piece of information he passed. He didn't hold anything back. Because Vivian asked him to. Because Vivian asked him to, Kane confirmed. He's not a danger. He's a man who made a catastrophically bad decision trying to protect something he cared about and got used by people who are significantly better at this than he is. He paused again. What do you want me to do with him? Damien looked at the table. What does Vivian want? She said she'd deal with Marcus herself, in her own time. He nodded. Then that's what happens. Kane closed the folder. He looked at Damien with the expression he used when he was going to say something personal, which was rare enough that Damien noticed it immediately. For what it's worth, Kane said, you made the right call. Every point where you had the choice between the organization and her, you chose her. I've worked for you for 11 years, and there were moments in the last 2 weeks where I wasn't certain you would. Damien looked at him. I wasn't certain either. Kane nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and looked at the window and said nothing else, because he was a man who understood that some things didn't need to be extended. Vivian went into labor 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early December, in a small hospital 40 miles from the Massachusetts farmhouse in a town called Crestfield that had a good maternity unit and no connection to any name that meant anything to anyone in the world she'd left behind. She'd been living in a rental house in Crestfield for 5 weeks by then. Not the farmhouse, she'd needed her own space, and Damien had understood that without being told and had arranged the rental through a clean channel and had not asked whether he was included in it. She'd told him the address. She hadn't told him what it meant that she was telling him. She'd let it mean what it meant. He'd come twice. Both times he'd driven up on a Saturday, stayed 4 hours and driven back. They'd eaten lunch, talked about small things and large things in the specific proportions that felt honest rather than managed, and he'd left without pushing for more than she was offering. She'd watched him drive away both times from the window of the rental house, and she'd noticed something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to name yet, but that she was also no longer trying to suppress. She called him from the hospital at 6:40 a.m. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake. I'm here, she said. It's starting. He said, I'm leaving now. She said, it's 4 hours. He said, I'll be there in 3. She almost said, you don't have to drive like that. She didn't say it. She said, okay, and hung up and handed the phone to the nurse and let the next several hours become what they were going to be. He arrived at 9:52 a.m. She knew because she heard him in the hallway, his voice asking the nurse something, the particular quality of his footsteps on the hospital linoleum, the way the air in the room changed when he came through the door. She didn't look at him immediately. She was in the middle of something that required her full attention, and she trusted him to read that, and he did. He came and stood near the window without speaking, near enough that she was aware of him, but not so near that she had to manage his presence, and he stayed there. And she understood later that those 2 hours were the most honest thing he'd done in their entire history together. He didn't need to perform. He just stayed. At 11:34 a.m., their daughter arrived. She came into the world with the immediate, outraged specificity of a person who had opinions about the transition and was not keeping them to herself. And the nurse laid her on Vivian's chest, and Vivian put her hand on the back of her daughter's head. Still damp, still new, warm, and impossibly real, and felt something in the center of herself that had been braced for so long it had forgotten it was braced finally, quietly, let go. She looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she looked at Damien. He was standing at the foot of the bed, and his face had done something she'd never seen it do in 2 years of marriage, and 2 weeks of crisis, and all the moments between. It had just opened. Not performed, not managed, not deployed toward any particular effect. Just open, the way faces are when something arrives that is larger than the apparatus you've built to handle things. His eyes were wet. He wasn't doing anything about that. "Hi," Vivian said. To him, or to the baby, or to both of them. She wasn't certain, and it didn't seem to matter. He came to the side of the bed. He didn't reach for the baby immediately. He looked at Vivian first, a question in his face, and she understood that he was asking permission, and she understood what it meant that he was asking. She shifted slightly. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and she transferred the baby into his arms with the specific care of someone handing over the most important thing they have. And she watched him receive her, watched him figure out the angle of his arms, the right way to hold something so small, the adjustment he made when she shifted her weight, and she watched his face while he did all of it. He didn't say anything for a long time. The baby made a small sound and his whole body responded to it, a micro-adjustment, a tightening of his arms, the instinctive protective movement of someone who has just become responsible for something and felt it change them on a cellular level. "She's so small," he said finally. His voice was rough. "She's the right size," Vivian said. He looked up at her. "What's her name?" he said. Vivian had been thinking about this for 6 weeks. She'd made lists and discarded them. She'd tried names against the feeling of her daughter, and none of them had fit until the week before, when she'd been sitting at the rental house kitchen table at 2 a.m, eating crackers and watching the December dark outside the window. And a name had simply arrived the way the right things sometimes do. Not with fanfare, just with the quiet certainty of something that has been waiting for you to be ready to receive it. "Nora," she said. "Nora Hale." He looked at the baby. At Nora. He turned the name over in whatever internal space he used for things that mattered. "Nora," he said. The baby made another sound, softer this time, and moved her face toward his chest with the blind, confident instinct of a new person looking for warmth. And Damien Moretti, who had built an empire on the premise that power was the only reliable currency, who had sat in a room 37 floors above the city and described his wife as useful, who had spent 2 weeks dismantling the consequences of that word and everything it had revealed, sat in a hospital chair in Crestfield, Massachusetts, and held his daughter and understood something that no transaction, no negotiation, no carefully built structure had ever taught him. There was no leverage here. There was no position to protect, no angle to work, no calculation that produced an advantage. There was only a 6-pound person who had arrived without any awareness of what she was arriving into and who needed nothing from him that he was capable of performing. She just needed him to show up. That was all. The whole of it. Vivian was discharged 2 days later. Damien drove them to the rental house in Crestfield because she'd asked him to, and he helped carry the things she had accumulated in the hospital. The small blankets, the bag, the car seat he'd driven to 3 different stores to find the right one, with the focused attention of a man who understands that competence in small things is the first language of trust. He got the car seat into the car correctly on the 2nd attempt. She pretended not to notice the first attempt. He noticed her pretending not to notice and said nothing, which she appreciated. She settled Nora into the seat and stood outside the car in the cold December air for a moment, looking at her daughter through the window. Strapped in, blinking at the new world with the slow, serious attention of someone taking inventory. Damien came and stood beside her. They stood together looking at Nora for a moment. "I need to tell you something," Vivian said. "Okay." I've been thinking about what you said at the farmhouse, about finding out what you're capable of when you're not measuring everything by what it produces. She kept her eyes on Nora. I don't know if you can do it. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's honest, and I decided a long time ago that honest was more important to me than comfortable. I know, he said. What I know is that the last 2 weeks, you made choices. Real ones. You chose the thing that cost you something every time there was a choice. She paused. That's not nothing. He was quiet. I'm not ready to make decisions about what we are, she said. I don't think you should be either. I think we both need to live in the actual days for a while and see what they produce. She looked at him finally. But I'm not telling you to leave. He held her gaze. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that if you want to be part of this, part of her, then be part of it. Not the version you think I want to see, the actual version, the one that shows up when it's hard and boring and you're not getting anything out of it. She looked back at Nora. She's going to need a person who shows up, not a performance of a person. I understand the difference, he said. Prove it every day, she said. That's all. He nodded once. They got into the car. He drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, checking the mirrors more than the road required, with the careful over-attention of a man transporting something irreplaceable. She watched him do it from the passenger seat and felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite love. Something that preceded both of those, something that was more like the acknowledgement that there was still material here, still something to work with, if they were both willing to do the work without the protection of pretense. She looked out the window at Crestfield Passing, the ordinary December streets, the bare trees, the houses with their lights on against the early dark. And she thought about a harbor town in Rhode Island that smelled like salt and truth, and a 42nd floor she was never going to go back to, and a pair of yellow shoes still in a white box in her bag that she had carried through every stage of the last 2 months without quite being able to put them down. She reached into the bag on the floor between her feet. She took the box out and held it in her lap and looked at it for a moment. The ribbon still slightly undone on one side, the white cardboard slightly creased from travel. And then she pulled the ribbon loose completely and lifted the lid and took one of the shoes out and held it in her palm. It was absurdly small. Even now, even with Nora real and present in the seat behind them, the smallness of it was its own kind of impact. Damien glanced over. He looked at the shoe in her hand. He looked back at the road. He didn't say anything. She put the shoe back in the box and put the box in the bag and looked out the window at the town that was not home yet, but might become it. And she let herself, carefully, provisionally, with full awareness of the cost of every previous time she'd done this and the distance between that and doing it again, let herself imagine a version of the future that was not just survival, not without pain, not without all the work that was still ahead. Not without the mornings when the memory of a gray hallway and a white box and a man's careless voice would arrive before she was awake enough to manage it. But alongside all of that, alongside the damage and the cost and the long accounting that wasn't finished yet, something that was quiet and small and genuinely possible. Damien pulled onto the street where the rental house was and slowed for the turn. In the back seat, Nora made a small sound. Not distress, just presence, just the announcement of herself to the car and the December air and the two people in the front who had somehow, through everything, managed to be here together on the other side of it. Vivian turned to look at her. Nora's eyes were open, dark and serious and very new, looking at the world the way people look at things before they've learned to perform their looking, with the raw, undefended attention of someone who hasn't yet decided what's worth seeing. Vivian looked at her daughter and felt the full weight of everything it had taken to get here. The elevator, the crackers, the harbor, the name on a phone, the farmhouse kitchen, the conversation that still wasn't finished and might never be entirely finished. All of it accumulated and present and genuinely, irrevocably hers. She looked at Nora and thought, you are the one thing in all of this that was never complicated. Damien cut the engine. The house was in front of them, the porch light on. She'd left it on before the hospital 2 days ago, in the ordinary, forgetful way of people who expect to come back to things. The light was warm and yellow in the December dark, and it turned the front of the house into something that looked, from the car, briefly, like the kind of place where ordinary life happened. She picked up her bag. She looked at him. He was looking at the house with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was new. There had been a time when she could catalog his expressions cleanly and file them without difficulty. But that was the expression of a woman who had been reading the performance rather than the person. And the person, she was understanding, was less legible than the performance had been. That would take longer. That was, in its own way, a better problem to have. "Come in," she said. He looked at her. "Not forever," she said. "Just tonight. Help me get her settled, and then we'll see." He nodded once. They got out of the car. He lifted Nora's seat with both hands, careful of the angle, and Vivian took her bag and her keys, and she walked up the porch steps, and she unlocked the door, and the warmth of the house came out to meet her. The particular warmth of a place that has been waiting, with the patient indifference of walls and floors, for its people to return. She held the door. He carried Nora inside, and the door closed behind them both on the December dark, on the last 6 months, on the 42nd floor and the harbor and everything that the word useful had cost, and the longer, slower, more demanding work that came after the cost. The door closed, and inside the house the porch light was still on, warm and yellow, visible from the street as a small ordinary signal to whatever was still moving through the dark, that someone was home. That someone had chosen, despite everything, to come home. That it was not the same home they'd started with and would never be, but that the people inside it were, for the first time, making it out of true materials, with full awareness of what they were building and what they were asking it to hold. Nora Hale, 6 pounds and 3 days old, looked at the ceiling of the rental house in Crestfield, Massachusetts, with the unguarded attention of someone encountering everything for the first time. And the story, not the empire, not the crisis, not the long, careful damage of two people who had tried to love each other through a language neither of them had been fluent in, but the actual story, the one that started not when they married but when they chose, in full knowledge of the cost, to try again, that story was only just beginning.